We are picking up from our class 2 weeks ago. We're in Melachim Aleph, chapter 1. We're in the middle of the chapter. We're going to start at Pasuk 32, Lamed Bet. To refresh our memory, we opened Melachim with a struggle for who will take over as David's successor. We said that David had not to this point named a specific successor, although it seems from the chapter he had given some kind of a promise to his wife Bathsheba that it would be Shelomo, which is why when Adoniah, his older, by many other standards, more fit son to take over the throne, decides, Ani imloch, I'm going to rule, and gathers with him Yoav and Eviatar and many other significant people, the alarm is set off for Natan HaNavi and Bathsheba that somebody else is trying to grab the throne in David's waning year. And this could be a problem for Shelomo and Bathsheba if David does not step up to the plate and name his successor. And so they create this whole plan where Bathsheba is going to come in and talk to the king and appeal to him emotionally. Then Natan HaNavi is going to come in and he's going to speak to the king and he's going to remind him about what's going on. And this all should trigger David to come and to name Shelomo as his successor. And that's exactly what happens. We're going to read now, starting in Pasuk Lamed Bet, the command of the king to coronate Shelomo as his successor and what that will do to Adoniah and his cohort trying to assume the throne without permission. So again, Melachim Aleph, chapter 1, verse 32. Vayomer HaMelech David, the king David says, Kir'u li leTzadok HaKohen, summon before me Tzadok HaKohen, Natan HaNavi, and to Natan the prophet, V'livnayahu ben Yehoyada, and to Benayahu ben Yehoyada, his one of his lead security people. So David has a Kohen, he has a prophet, and he also has his lead warrior. Vayavo lifnei hamelech, and they come before the king. Amy, I think there's another old the Hebrew Tanakh over there, straight ahead, the red one, left. There, yeah, exactly. Good. So they all come before the king. Verse 33. Vayomer hamelech lahem. The king says to them, Kehu imachem et avdei adonechem. Take my loyal soldiers with you. V'hirkavtem et Shelomo beni ala pirda asher li. And ride Shelomo, my son, on the donkey that it belongs to me. V'horadtem oto el Gihon. And bring him down to the Gihon river. Candice had a good explanation last class about why the donkey. Do you remember what it was? Yeah. Okay, good. So a horse is more of a warrior type animal. They took them into battle. A donkey is a much more peaceful, more workload type animal. And so Shlomo, as his name indicates, shalom, peace, is going to be a very different type of melucha, very different type of reign than that of David. Whereas David's reign was filled with battles and bloodshed and fighting against enemies and running away from people trying to kill him, Shlomo's is going to be, although it's starting out slightly rocky, it's going to be a relatively peaceful reign. Shelomo is not going to have to fight against any enemies. He's going to build the Bet HaMikdash. He's going to focus inward on the spiritual nature of the Jewish people. Verse 34, Umashach oto sham tzadok HaKohen, V'natan HaNavi lemelech al Yisrael. David commands that they should coronate and anoint Shelomo, Tzadok HaKohen, and Natan HaNavi as the king over Israel. Utka'atem bashofar, and you will blow the sound of the shofar. Va'amartem, and you will say, Yehi HaMelech Shelomo, long live the king Shlomo. Verse 35, this is all part of David's command. Va'alitem aharav uba v'yashav al kisi. Then you will march up after him, and he will come and sit on my throne. And he will rule after me. For it is he who I have commanded, I have appointed to be the Nagid, to be the ruler. Nagid comes from the word like the orator, right, or the oracle of the Jewish people. But in this context, it means to be the ruler of the Jewish people. Al Yisrael ve'al Yehuda. Now we come to the response. Verse 36. Vayan Benayahu ben Yehoyada et hamelech. Benayahu ben Yehoyada answers the king, Vayomer, Amen, Ken Yomar Adonai. Yes, Amen. It is truthful what you say. We will follow. So says God, Elohe Adoni HaMelech, the God of our master, the king. Ka'asher haya Adonai im Adoni HaMelech, just as God was with our master, the king, that is to say, David, Ken yihye im Shelomo. So too he shall be with Shelomo. This is essentially a beracha, a blessing that Benayahu is presenting to the king Shlomo. V'yigadelet kis'o, his throne will be exalted, mikise Adoni HaMelech David, even higher than that of the throne of the king David. This is a typical blessing and one that is not disrespectful in any way, shape, or form to the king. For what king doesn't want his son to not only take over, but to expand and to better the kingdom? Just like every parent wishes for their child to be even more successful and more prosperous and more wise than they are, so too every king who's transferring the kingdom to their successor, especially their child, wants their throne to be even greater and their rule to be even greater than theirs. Especially when you consider the turmoil that David had to go through during the course of his life as the king. Certainly they're saying his rule should be a lot smoother than that David experienced. Verse 38, Pasuk Lamed Chet. Vayered Tzadok HaKohen, V'Natan HaNavi, U'Bnayahu ben Yehoyada, the priest Tzadok, the prophet Natan, Benayahu the son of Yehoyada, V'Hakreti V'Hapleti, and the soldiers of David, who were known as the Kereti and the Peleti, the Cheretites and the Pelachites, right? How you want to say it, I don't know. The different soldiers that were missionaries for David. Vayarkivu et Shelomo al pirdat hamelech David. They indeed walk Shelomo on top, ride Shelomo on the donkey of the king. And they vayolichu oto al Gihon, and they walk him down to the Gihon River. A reminder that the Gihon River is within the limits of the city of Yerushalayim. So whereas Adoniah, being nervous about crowning himself as king without permission inside of the city of David of Jerusalem, he went outside the city of Jerusalem. David, on the other hand, commands that Shlomo be coronated inside the walls of Jerusalem to show a sense of togetherness with the people and a solidifying of the city of Yerushalayim itself, which is what David was known for, the establishment of the city of Jerusalem. Verse 40, I believe. Verse 39. Vayikach Tzadok HaKohen ve'et keren HaShemen. Tzadok takes the keren of the shemen, the horn of oil, min ha'ohel, from the tent. Vayimshach et Shelomo, and he anoints Shlomo as king. Vayitkeu b'shofar, and they blow the sound of the shofar. Vayomeru kol ha'am, all of the people in attendance declare, Yehi HaMelech Shlomo, long live the king Shlomo. Interesting, the rabbis note the word keren in this pasuk, the horn of oil. That is to say, they had some kind of a horn that they put oil into and they used that to anoint. Why is the word horn, keren, very interesting? Because the word keren is used when referring to the anointing of David and of Shelomo, whose kingdoms endured and were not taken away from them. However, the coronation of Shaul HaMelech, for example, was not with a keren, was not with a horn. Instead, the Tanakh, I forget offhand, uses a different word to talk about the jug or jar of oil that they used to coronate. Why is that important? Because if you go all the way back to Shemuel Aleph, when Hannah was praying to have Shelomo, it says at the end of her prayer, you remember? V'yarem keren meshicho, and the horn of the anointed one shall be raised up. And she uses specifically the word horn, which the rabbis say was a prophecy of sorts, a premonition of sorts, that anybody who would be coronated with a keren, with a horn, will be considered a Mashiach, a savior and an anointed one of God whose kingdom would endure. However, Shaul, who was coronated with a different utensil, it was almost as if it was already hinted in his coronation that his kingdom would not endure because of the mistakes that he would made, that it would be taken away from him. That's not to say that Shaul didn't have Bechirah Hofshit, the free will to make his decisions, but it's almost like in hindsight, looking back on it, it was already hinted to in the beginning, a foreshadowing of what it was versus the coronation of David and Shlomo, which was done with a keren. Now that I just double back for a minute, does it use the terminology, because I'm not sure, of what it says that he used to coronate Adoniah? I don't think that it mentions it. I don't even know if he used anything. Does it even talk about the anointing? It just says, I got to go all the way back up to the beginning of the chapter. No, it doesn't even talk about any type of anointing when it comes to Adonijah. It just says that they gave sacrifices and they did things and they feasted and they said, oh, he's the king. But it doesn't even give a coronation. So again, you could see elements of Adonijah's attempt to coronate himself are missing from what the coronation of Shelomo, giving Shelomo's coronation a more of an official status in the eyes of the people, more so than what Adonijah experienced himself. Adonijah doesn't have a prophet, he doesn't have a shofar, he doesn't have coronating oil, he doesn't have any of those ingredients that are typically found in the coronation of the king. And so missing those elements kind of lowers his status. So did they prefer Shelomo as opposed to anybody else? What we will see is very quickly the attempt of Adonijah and his camp to take over dissolves almost instantaneously. Because as we noted before, the moment David actually named the king, what Adonijah and his group were banking on was that David would be passive, he wouldn't say anything, and he would die before he named the successor. If that happened, then Adonijah has what to say. Oh, nobody was named the successor, I should be taken. He gambled on that fact that David would not name a successor. Bathsheba and Natan's whole plan is step up to the plate, name a successor, and there won't be any doubt about it, which is what David does. So it's not so much that they preferred Shelomo as much as the people just wanted David's clear statement, a stamp of approval on who should be the king. Really what everybody wanted to know is, who is David going to choose? And we'll go after whoever David chooses. Until David made a choice, they said, hey, Adonijah is just as good as anybody. Once David makes the choice and Shlomo's coronation is clearly into everybody's eyes the official coronation, they're fine with Shelomo and his pick, and Adonijah's camp will dissolve very, very quickly. We will see as the chapters go on that Shelomo will have some challenges on establishing his grasp of the throne. The rabbis tell us, it's not going to mention it explicitly, but the rabbis tell us that Shelomo was very young. They put him at the age of 13 as the ruler of the Jewish people. So at the age of 13, that's a kind of a hard age to assume the kingdom. David was a na'ar. We don't give a specific name in age, but he also seemed to be pretty young. But the challenge but don't forget, David also then went on the run from Shaul for many years until he was finally established. David is 70 years old when he dies, and he rules for 40 years, which means he really takes on the establishment of king at the age of 30, right? That's a pretty decent age to assume the role where people will give you that respect. Shelomo seems to not have that. Shelomo has to gain the respect of the people, which is why in chapter 3, when God comes to him and says, I'll give you whatever you want, what does Shelomo choose? He says, I want the wisdom to judge the people. And that's how he's going to earn the respect of the nation. It seems it will take him some time, and he has to do a couple of things to earn the respect of the people before they unequivocally accept him as the king. And we'll see how that goes as the chapter moves on. He's so young. Maybe he couldn't reach the pedals, right? Yeah, maybe not. Maybe. We don't get an actual age in the text of the Torah itself, of the Navi itself. It doesn't tell us how old he is. That's how the rabbis put it in the Midrash.
Or is he just banking on since he didn't name anyone?
Good question. Well, does Adonijah know? And what rides on this question? In other words, what difference does it make if he knows or not? He has a Kohen, Eviatar. Correct. He didn't invite Shlomo. I think correct. Right. He didn't have what he did. But the question is, why not? So that's my answer to the question of, did Adonijah know that he wasn't supposed to? My answer is, I think yes. I think he did know. Right. And at least the text portrays Adonijah in a way where he does this maliciously. That is to say, he specifically doesn't invite Shelomo because he knows Shelomo is his competitor and he knows that he's the one who can undermine him. And he doesn't. I think so. I think that's why. Because otherwise, why would he care about Shelomo if he doesn't know? Why would he see him as a threat as much? If not, if he's his little brother, so what? He thinks I'm the guy. And he doesn't invite Natan and he doesn't invite Benayahu. The fact that he leaves these people off the guest list leads me to believe that he understood what he was doing was sneaky, was deceiving, and he was trying to get in, hoping that nobody would combat him and that David wouldn't make a choice. When he realizes that, he doesn't even feign, he doesn't say, oh, I didn't know, it was a mistake. He's not going to come with any of those claims. He just runs away. He runs away. He realizes what he did and he runs away. That's what he's going to do because he understands the ramifications of his actions. And that's what all leads me to believe that he understood full well what he was doing. He recognized the undermining nature of his actions. And as a result, he knows he's in big trouble. Eviatar and Yoav? Yeah, absolutely. They all know they're in trouble. Every one of them knows they're in trouble. They all know the fate of what they did. Yes, they will face that square in the eyes.
Yes.
Yoav also has a lot of other issues on his resume as well. Yeah. Yeah, Yoav definitely knows he's in big trouble, and he knows this is the last. This could very well be the straw that broke the camel's back for everything that he did. We're going to see how they approached. The end of this chapter and next chapter is going to be all about dealing with Adoniah's cohort. Shlomo is going to deal with Adoniah. He's going to deal with Eviatar. He's going to deal with Yoav, and we're going to see how all that plays out. Each one differently than the next. Who's that? Yoav killed somebody. Yeah. No, that's Shimi ben Gera. You're thinking about Shimi ben Gera. Shimi is not over here. Shimi ben Gera is the one who cursed David, who David promised him that he wouldn't kill him. Yoav.
I'll go with him.
Potentially. But Yoav knows that he's about to face major consequences. Julie?
A little like a mirror. I'm really feeling like a lot of the Yitzchak's favorite wife was Rivka, and Yaakov's favorite wife was Rivka, and the favorite Rachel, and the favorite son was Shelomo.
It's okay.
The favorite son was Yosef, and the other brothers knew it, and they tried to get ahead. Like he had to know Bathsheba was David's favorite wife, and that Shelomo is the golden child, and it just.
You're saying Adoniah had to know that.
I'm saying, yeah, it feels like Adoniah is in the position of the brothers who try to get rid of Yosef because
I see some parallels there. There could be some parallel shades to, certainly brotherly tension is something that exists all over the Tanakh, right?
So many of those favorite wives.
So here it's not coming so much from favoritism as much as, and this is something we have to talk about, is what makes Shelomo and Bathsheba the ones who David promised would be the chosen ones to succeed him. I think this is more about Adoniah disrespecting his father. Adoniah doesn't seek counsel with David. Why doesn't he go to David and say, I want to be the king? He deliberately cuts David out of it. He deliberately tries to skirt around it behind his back, hoping that nothing will happen to him. And he gets called out on it. I see it a little differently than the Yosef brothers situation where all of them are eventually chosen, but one is chosen to be a little bit different than the rest of them. This is really a contentious experience between Adoniah and Shlomo, where Adoniah tries to deceive. He tries to connive his way to the throne. It doesn't work out for him. Yeah. Let's keep going through the chapter and see what ends up happening. Verse 40. All of the people, so you're getting the sense that everyone is rallying around Shlomo. They follow behind Shlomo. The nation is playing the flutes and singing usmechim simcha gdola, and there is great festivity and joy over the coronation of Shlomo. Batibaka haaretz bekolam, and the earth was split open by the uproar, which is probably an exaggerative term for the ground was like shaking as a result of how joyous and how jubilant the entire experience really was. Vayishma Adoniyahu v'chol hakiruim asher ito v'hem kilu le'echol. So much so that the sound, the reverberation of the joyousness and Shlomo's coronation reaches to Adoniah and all of his feasters together with him, and they finish eating. Vayishma Yoav et kol hashofar. Yoav hears the sound of the shofar. Vayomer, and he says, Madua kol hakiryah homa. Why is the city in such an uproar? What's going on? Verse 42. Odenu medaber. He's still in the process of speaking. V'hinei Yonatan ben Evyatar haKohen ba. Yonatan, the son of Evyatar, who is the Kohen, who we know him as the runner. He was the runner in the spy between Avshalom's camp and David's camp, going back to the book of Shemuel Bet. Yonatan, the son of Evyatar, who obviously has a connection with his father, Evyatar HaKohen, who's with Adoniah now, comes and says, Vayomer Adoniyahu bo. Adoniyahu tells him, come, Ish hayel ata, you're a man of strength and valor. V'tov tivaser, and you surely bring good news. He was the one who brought the good news that Avshalom was dead. So in the past, Yonatan has been the bearer of good news. So Adoniah thinks this is a sign that Yonatan has appeared. He's the bearer of good news. Something great has happened for him. Unfortunately, he is not bearing good news at all, at least not for Adoniah. Vaya'an Yonatan vayomer la'Adoniah. Yonatan answers and says to Adoniah, Aval. And right away he starts with a bad word. But Adonenu HaMelech David himlich et Shlomo. You should know that our master, the King David, crowned Shlomo as king. Verse 44, Vaishlach, he tells him the story, Vaishlach ito HaMelech et Tzadok HaKohen bet Natan HaNavi, Ubnayahu ben Yoyada v'Akreti v'Apleti. The king sent together with Shlomo, Tzadok and Natan and Benayahu and the Kreti and Pleti and all the soldiers. V'Yarkivu oto al Perdat HaMelech, and they rode him on the mule of the king. Vayimshechu oto Tzadok HaKohen, they anointed him, Tzadok and Natan HaNavi, lemelech beGichon, as the king in the Gichon River. Vaya'alu misham smechim, they went up from that area all jubilant and rejoicing. Vatehom hakiryah, and the city went into an uproar. Hu hakol asher shematem, that's the noise that all of you are hearing. Verse 46, V'gam yashav Shlomo al kiseh hamelucha, and furthermore Shlomo has sat upon the royal throne. This is over for you. And the servants of the king have come to bless our master, the King David, saying, Yetiv Elohim et Shem Shlomo mishemecha. Let God make the name of Shlomo greater than your name. And let him raise up his seat above the seat of the throne of the king. And the king bowed low on his couch. That's it. David has officially transferred the kingdom to Shlomo. Verse 48, V'gam kacha amar hamelech. And if you think that the king himself didn't do it, the further is what the king said. Baruch Adonai Elohei Yisrael, blessed is God, the God of Israel, asher natan hayom yoshev al kisi ve'enai ro'ot, who has placed upon the throne of the king, and my eyes have been able to see it. So there's no debating what's going on over here. There's no David wasn't in control. He wasn't aware of what's happening. He himself blessed it. He saw it. He put his stamp of approval on it. But what's the reaction of the cohort when they hear this? Verse 49, Vayeherdu vayakumu kol hakiruim asher la'Adoniah. Thereupon, all of Adoniah's guests rose and they trembled. Vayeherdu. They were struck with fear, and they got up. Vayelchu ish ledarko, and they all went on their way. They got out of there faster than anything you could say. I don't know. They got out of there, right? And they realized this is done. They don't even try to say, let's fight it, let's battle it, let's this, let's that. They know they've lost. They took a gamble, and the gamble did not pay off. Exactly. So now the question is, what are they going to do? Now, where are they going to go? So the people who were invited, the people who stayed, they're hoping, hey, we're just going to get out of here. We're going to blend in and we're going to pretend like this never happened. But the leaders of the rebelling cohort, Adoniah, Evyatar, Yoav, they can't just run away. They know that they've been targeted now, and they realize they're in deep trouble. Verse 50, Adoniah yareh mepnei Shelomo. Adoniah was in fear of Shlomo. Vayakom vayelech, he goes and he runs. Vayahazek bekarnot hamizbeach, and he grasps on to the corners of the Mizbeach. So the word keren comes up again over here, interestingly enough. Keren meaning here the corner, right? A pointed area. And again, that word might be very significant as well over here. Why does he do this? What is holding on to the corners of the Mizbeach mean? What is he even doing over here? So what? So first of all, remember, we don't have a Beit HaMikdash, and we really don't have a Mishkan over here either. We kind of have a an unofficial place where sacrifices are brought and an altar where people bring their korbanot, but we don't really have a central point. The Mishkan has really been destroyed. It's never been rebuilt. And the Beit HaMikdash is not yet to be built. That will come in the time of Shelomo. So there's an area where people give sacrifices, but it's not as official. Nevertheless, there is a pasuk in the Torah that says, when a person commits murder and he's liable for the death penalty, the pasuk says, Me'im mizbechi tikachenu lamut. You will pull him away from the mizbeach to put him to death. That is to say, when a person is liable for the death penalty, some reason he may come to grab on to the corners of the mizbeach as a sign of peace. Maybe because he's asking for mercy, as Julie contends, or it's just a holy place. You're not going to strike somebody dead on the mizbeach. The mizbeach is a sign of peace. Remember, the mizbeach cannot be made with any metal. It has to be made with peaceful materials. It's a sign of peace and elongating of life. To kill somebody while they're holding on to the mizbeach is the opposite of what the mizbeach represents. So there's this notion that when you hold on to the mizbeach, it's like a safe spot. It's like home base when kids are playing tag. Nobody can come and kill you when you're there, right? So that's what Adoniyah does. It also might be a way of Adoniyah surrendering to Shelomo. Like when you hold on to the mizbeach, it's basically a clear sign of, I give up. I realize that I made a mistake. Please don't kill me. Have mercy. I let everything go, right? So that might be Adoniyah's way of trying to throw himself at the mercy of Shelomo. If Shelomo finds out that he is holding on to the kanot mizbeach, maybe he won't see Adoniyah as a threat anymore, and maybe he won't need to kill him. And that's kind of what Adoniyah is trying to signal with this idea. And that gets back to Shelomo, and that might actually have a major effect on how Shelomo deals with Adoniyah. Let's see what happens. Verse 51. Vayugad l'Shlomo lemor. This fact is told to Shelomo. Hine Adoniyahu yare et hamelech Shlomo. Behold, Adoniyah is in fear of the king Shlomo. How do we know? V'hine ahaz bekarnot hamizbeach. He went and he grabbed onto the corners of the altar. Lemor, as if to say, or saying, Yishavali kayom hamelech Shlomo im yamit et avdo beharev. Let King Shlomo first swear to me that he will not put his servant to the sword. In other words, I am not letting go until you promise me you won't kill me. But I'm not a threat to you, so why kill me? Vayomer Shlomo, Shlomo says, Im hiye leben hayil, if he behaves in a worthy manner, lo yipol misa'arato arza, a hair shall not fall off of his head. V'im ra'ati matzebo, but if evil shall be found with him, vamet, he will die. Shlomo accepts it. Shlomo says, be a good soldier, follow the protocol, don't cause any more problems, I'll let you live, no problem. Do something wrong, and I will kill you. I will put you to death. Correct. Yeah, I knew everyone would like this, right? So Shlomo is, as he said, indicative of shalom, and he's willing to give Adoniyah that chance. He's willing to overlook it, and he's willing to give him asylum, right? We will see that Adoniyah, it's so funny that some people, they just can't help themselves, right? And Adoniyah, it's in their nature to be troublemakers. Adoniyah is going to step out of line in the next chapter. And that's why you're going to say, you know what, this guy really deserves what he gets. Because here, I gave you a second chance. We're going to let you go. Just be good, right? And Adoniyah can't help himself. We're going to see what Adoniyah is going to do. That eventually will cause Shlomo to put him to death. Yes. Isruhan ba'abotim ad karnot hamizbeach. Right. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Right. We will see, though, interestingly, we will see another person hang on to the corners of the mizbeach. That will be Yoav. And Shlomo will not be so understanding with Yoav. He's going to tell him, I don't care if you have to kill him on the mizbeach. You do what you got to do. Right. So we're going to see it's not all rainbows and sunshines as far as Shlomo goes. It just depends on who you are and what you've done. So this is Shlomo's first real approach, and this is for Shlomo to decide, because Adoniyah is ultimately a threat to him, and we're going to see that David is going to approve of what Shlomo does, and he's going to even give Shlomo more things to do like this. He's going to tell him, Ve'asita kechochmatecha. David has a number of, what do they call it, when something's not finished, loose ends, thank you. David's got a bunch of loose ends. That's have an English teacher with you, right? David's got a bunch of loose ends to tie up at the end of his life, and a lot of things that he himself cannot tie up, that he's going to give over to Shelomo to tie up those loose ends. And David's going to tell him, I want you to do as your wisdom dictates for you to do. David's going to actually pass the ball over to Shelomo and say, you do as you see fit, which is a major stamp of approval from David to Shelomo. What? He's going to give him some vague things to do, and he's going to tell him, you deal with it as you see fit, which David is not going to tell him, do this, this, and this. He's going to tell him, you have an issue here. I want you deal with it as you see as fit. David is going to give him those tests, and it's going to be a major sign of David stepping away and saying, Shlomo, it's your turn to do things the way you feel it's going. He might be. Shlomo may be ahead of his years. He's certainly very wise. It exists. It's there. It can happen. Yeah, age is but a number in so many different ways, right? Age is but a number. Yes. Yet. But clearly you have to be someone who's worthy of it to be given it, right? Shlomo, if Shlomo is going to exhibit his own level of wisdom, that is going to make him a worthy candidate for receiving the divine wisdom, right? You can't just get everything from God. You have to be a vessel to receive it. So we're going to see Shlomo deal with things in a very clever way. We're going to see he already has a nice amount of wisdom, right? Before God goes ahead and gives it to him, right? And gives him even more to be able to do.
Actions are very ambiguous, and he never really, he was told you don't really discipline him because he kind of thought, well, maybe he's doing it in a good way. He was giving him the benefit of the doubt. Now it looks like his son says, okay.
That's interesting. Right. So Shlomo is definitely giving him another opportunity. He's giving him another chance, even though we know Adoniah is the type of person who is a troublemaker. David hasn't disciplined enough. But to come on the scene first and foremost as the younger brother and start disciplining, Shlomo says, let's see how this plays out, right? Okay. Verse 53, the final pasuk in chapter 1. Vayishlach hamelech Shlomo vayoriduhu me'al hamizbeach. Shlomo sends a messenger to take Adoniah off of the altar, telling him it's okay for you not to be there anymore. Vayavo vayishtachu lamelech Shlomo. And Adoniah comes before the king and prostrates himself before Shlomo. Vayomed lo Shlomo lech lebetech. Shlomo tells him, go back to your home. You're free to go, and we'll see how the rest goes about. This is a nice way to end the first chapter. We're ushering in a very different type of kingdom now. We're starting off on a very positive note. So that takes us to that's the end of chapter 1, and that could take us to chapter 2. I wanted to read beforehand one important idea that Rabbi Israel over here brings up, which is a little bit of the controversy around Shlomo. Right? It's interesting that everybody just accepts Shlomo after David says it, when there's some room to maybe call Shlomo out into question, right? He writes the following: of all David's wives, Bathsheba is entangled in scandal, and her son Shlomo would at first glance be a contentious and unlikely candidate for the succession, tainted as he is by his parents' sin. The text cannot ignore this problem. Can Shlomo move beyond the past? Shlomo's got a hurdle to climb. He will always be looked at as the product of David and Bathsheba's actions. So who's to say that nobody comes up and says, really, this guy's going to be the next king? Can't we pick someone with a little less controversy and shadiness swirling him? The conclusion is a resounding yes. What this chapter seeks to tell us is there is no controversy. Everybody's with it. This chapter teaches us that Shlomo is the suitable successor. This fact has already been affirmed by the book of Shmuel in verses that may have formed the textual basis for Radak's interpretation. What does the Radak say? The Radak writes, David consoled his wife Bathsheba. He went and lay with her. She bore a son, and she named him Shlomo. The Lord loved him, and he sent a message through the prophet Natan, and he called his name Yedidiah as the instance of the Lord. Those are the Pisukim in Shmuel. Already in Shmuel, we got a glimpse of the fact that Shlomo was beloved to God. He's called Yedidiah, the beloved of God, and he's the choicest person to assume the throne. These verses affirm that despite the illicit beginnings of the union between David and Bathsheba, Shlomo is the beloved of God. And so this chapter seeks to put to bed, to rest, any potential controversy which people may have, It's clear Shlomo is the successor. Adonijah does not stand a chance. And the entire nation rallies around Shlomo and accepts him as the king, despite whatever gray areas there may be surrounding Shlomo taking over. And that is a very important starting point for us in the Book of Kings. Questions? Yeah.
It seems that all of the kings have a questionable scandalous start, because Yehuda, and it all starts with Yehuda and Tamar, which is scandalous, and then you have David and you have right. So like, and it comes, it's
Right.
It's not the perfect.
Right.
So
So Liz makes a great point, and it's something we talked about a lot through Shemuel, and we'll continue to talk in the book of Melachim, is that, it's not a coincidence that Jewish kingship happens through stories that to the reader, to the casual reader, are like, really, this is where you want royalty to sort of come from? Royalty is supposed to be pure and perfect and 100%. And it's specifically that the Torah goes out of its way to show you that Jewish royalty is not necessarily coming from that. Because ultimately the human being is never the ultimate power. It's always that the human being is an extension of God. So it's perfect that the human embodiment of royalty should never be perfect. This way, he can never claim to be a God. One of the things that the ancient pharaohs all did, and all of the ancient royal monarchs did, was all claim themselves as God, right? The concept of absolute rule, the concept of divine rulership coming to you as a God, was always something that existed in all of the dictatorships and monarchies of ancient civilizations. Judaism is clearly different than that. Every royal has human elements to them, has made mistakes, has come about because of mistakes. And that's to highlight and illustrate the point that no royal is ultimately a divine person. And not to mention the fact that royalty is about admitting mistakes and climbing above those mistakes, because no royal is going to be perfect. They're always going to have errors and faults, as every human being has. So there's no question that is a thread that runs throughout anytime we talk about Malchut. And that certainly will be in the case of kings. Unfortunately, we'll see it too often that many of the kings here will not be good people. So that will also be problematic, huh? Sure, the royal does not rule. He has checks and balances, right? When you say a team, there's checks and balances for the royal. There's the prophet, there's the kohen, there are the judges, there are the zikanim. Nobody does everything. Nobody has total power. There's a system in place. Now, true, the king has a tremendous amount of power, but it's always kept in check by a lot of those other people. Let's move to chapter 2 now and see how far we get into it. We only have about 15, 17 minutes left. But now we're going to see how Shlomo takes hold of the kingdom and how it's passed from David to his son. We'll call this chapter about stabilizing the monarchy. So even though Shlomo has accepted the rule, there's still some instability in that there's still some Adonijah lingers and Yoav lingers and Evyatar lingers. So there's some level of instability. How do we stabilize the monarchy in the hands of Shlomo? Verse 1 of chapter 2. Vayikrevu yemei David lamut. The days of David came close to dying. In other words, we're ever so much closer to David's death. Vayitzavet Shelomo beno lemor. And he gives his son final instructions as he's ready to pass away. Verse 2, Anochi holech bederech kol haaretz. I am going in the way of the land. That is to say, I'm about to pass away. V'hazakta v'hayita leish. You shall be strong and be a man. That is to say, step up to the plate. V'shamarta et mishmeret Adonai Elohecha lalechet b'drachav. You shall guard the keepsake of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, lishmor chukotav, to observe his statutes, mitzvotav, his commands, mishpatav, his rules, ve'edvotav, his admonitions, kakatuv betorat Moshe, as is written in the Torah of Moshe, leman taskil et kol asher ta'aseh, in order that you may succeed and be wise in all that you do, ve'et kol asher tifnei sham, and wherever you turn. This is a critical pasuk, very, very important pasuk, one that is perhaps a banner pasuk for all of the book of Kings. Because what is David telling Shlomo his primary goal is as the king of the Jewish people? To follow the Torah, to ensure that the people guard the laws, to make sure that you put the nation in prime position to be able to have a clear relationship with God, that they should observe the laws of the Torah in as much as they have been given by Moshe Rabbeinu. You're not making anything new. You're not making any new establishments. Your job is to create a kingdom and an atmosphere that's foundation is the Torah. And that's very important because really to this point, we've always seen the king as a political ruler, as somebody who's controlling the nation. And finally, David reminds Shelomo, don't forget your prime objective is king, Torah. That's what it is. And this is so important also in reflecting back on David, which is showing that that was David's priority all along. As he was running away from Shaul and trying to figure out what to do with his sons and his children and it was always about Torah. Even though in the simple narrative, we didn't necessarily see that so much, this reminds us of that. And every king from here on out is going to be judged based on that benchmark, based on the benchmark of David and Torah. And that's very, very important. Verse 4, Le'ma'an yakim Adonai et devaro. If you should do this, then the Lord will fulfill the promise, Asher diber alai lemor, that he said to me, saying, Im yishmenu banecha et darkam, if your children will keep to the path, Lalechet lefanai be'emet, to walk with me in truth, b'chol levavam u'b'chol nasham, with all their heart and with all their soul. Shades of what? Shema Yisrael. B'chol levavecha v'chol nafshecha. Lemor, saying, Lo yikaret lecha ish me'al kisei Yisrael. Your line on the throne of Israel shall never end. David says, God has made a promise with us that as long as we obey the rules of the Torah, our family will maintain the line of kings moving forward. But what does that tell you? The opposite is also true, that should they not maintain it, the line will break apart. Now that's fascinating because in some other areas that we saw the promise of kingship, we said the kings always have to come from Yehudah, and eventually they will come back. But David is telling Shelomo there are no guarantees. Nothing is 100%. You will lose the kingdom if you don't go straight in the path of God. And unfortunately, this does come to a reality because Shelomo at the end of his days veers, and as a result, the kingdom is torn in two, and other tribes will claim rule of the other kingdoms. It is what it is. It's never a guarantee. Everything is in the hands of following the path of Hashem. Nothing is given to you without sacrifice and obedience. Verse 5. It's still Mashiach ben David. It'll always come back to it eventually. There's a promise that long term it will come back to you. But in the short term, David is telling Shelomo, you yourself will lose it. It might come back to you, but you will lose your grasp if you don't keep to the laws of the Torah. Never tell yourself, I'm from the tribe of David, I'm from the lineage of Yehudah. It's guaranteed for me. No. Now maybe it's David's way of telling him, like scaring him kind of, like even though David knows and Shelomo knows that it will always be with him, you don't want to rely on that. You want it to be that way, but it's clear that Shelomo loses his grasp on the kingdom at the end. Right. Correct. Right. And that could still exist simultaneously with the fact that we will always be Hashem's nation. In other words, the fact that Hashem promises us long term, you will always be my nation, does not contradict the idea that if you don't keep the berit, God will distance from you and punishment will ensue. And there may be a temporary loss of Eretz Yisrael, of your status, until you're ready to go ahead and regain it. So that's what David is telling Shelomo over here as well. Verse 5, he says, so that's the first point. Now he tells him how to deal with these loose ends, as we said. He says, you are also aware, Asher asali Yoav ben Siruya, what Yoav, the son of Siruya, did to me, how he undermined my authority. What did he do? Asher asali shne saret tzivot Yisrael. What he did to two officers of the Jewish people. LeAvner ben Ner, go all the way back to the beginning of the book of Shemuel Bet. He killed Avner ben Ner, who was supporting at the time Mephibosheth, right? Ishbosheth, I should say. And then eventually switched teams, and Yoav didn't want to accept it because Avner had killed Yoav's brother. Okay. Vela Amasa ben Yeter, and what he did to the chief general Amasa, who was put in his place. Vayahargem, he murdered both of them. Vayasem demem milchama b'shalom, and he gave them blood of war at times of peace. In other words, he shed their blood even though they were not a real threat to them. He killed them in situations when he wasn't supposed to. They were not coming to attack him. Vayiten demem milchama b'hagorato asher b'motnav, staining the girdle of his loins and the sandals on his feet, ubena'alo asher beraglav, in the blood of war. That is to say that Yoav has the stains of innocent blood on his hands of two people, and he will not accept that to be the case. I was waiting for someone to say that, right? Now, we also know the fact that David has these feelings for his son Avshalom, very mixed feelings for his son Avshalom, and that Yoav did kill Avshalom, but he doesn't mention them here. Why do you think he doesn't mention Avshalom? Avshalom is certainly not innocent. Correct. Not to mention, David might have come back to the idea of maybe he was wrong for the way he treated the Avshalom situation. Maybe ultimately he came to the realization Yoav was right in the long run for killing Avshalom in his rebellion against David and what that meant for the rest of the men. So while David may have had those personal feelings, he doesn't share them now with his son Shelomo about how to deal with that, because he doesn't maybe want Shelomo to conduct his kingdom in that same way that he did. Ultimately, David realizes that he was at fault for the way he had handled the Avshalom situation. So he's got enough on Yoav to tell Shelomo, you need to avenge the death of these two, where he doesn't need to bring up Avshalom. David, remember, why didn't David take care of it himself? Remember that David has... So here's my answer. My answer is David still owes Yoav a lot, right? Yoav was with him through a lot of difficult situations and helped David overcome a lot of challenges where David faltered, right? So maybe David is saying to kill Yoav for himself is to not have hakarat hatov for the good things that Yoav did do for him and the mistakes that David himself made. David feels himself in his own transgressions unworthy of taking out that responsibility on Yoav. The same with a lot of the other ones. David almost views himself as, I've sinned as well, and I've made some mistakes as well, and I owe a lot to these people. I am not the one who can carry this out. It has to be the next person who has an untainted resume at that time to go ahead and handle this situation. So that's a little bit of David's humility coming about. He realizes that it's not for him to do it at this point. Okay, maybe he wants to throw some things at Shelomo to see how he kind of handles it. He needs to be, in other words, Shelomo has to be the one to stabilize his own monarchy as opposed to Papa doing everything for him. That could be another secondary thing. I think it's more coming from David's perspective than about Shlomo's, yeah. Verse 6, yeah. Right, that's a hakarat hatov that he does, the inanimate object of Moshe not taking out the plague, but that was also at God's command. God told Aharon to go ahead and do it. So definitely hakarat hatov is a big element, and I think David, because of that, has to step back from this interaction. He can't be the one to do it himself. Verse 6, ve'asita kechochmatecha. David says to Shlomo, you do in your wisdom what is fit. He doesn't even tell him exactly what to do or how to do it. Velo tored sevato b'shalom sheol. But he does say, see to it that his white hair does not go down to Sheol in peace. In other words, Yoav is not to leave this world in the regular way that everybody does. He has to suffer the consequences, but you figure out how to do it. Okay, we'll see what Shelomo does. Now that's the bad stuff. What about some of the positive things? Now David sprinkles in a good story. Verse 7, V'livnei barzilai hagiladi ta'aseh chesed. Act graciously and with kindness to the children of Barzilai hagiladi. V'hayu be'ochle shulchanecha. They should always be from amongst those who eat at your table. We've often seen that phrase as a sign of the king bringing people close. Ki chen karvu elai bevorchim mipnei Avshalom avicha. For they did kindness with me. They let me be among them when I was running away from Avshalom, your brother. Here is where he mentions Avshalom in the context of you have to do hakarat hatov. You have to recognize in a kind way those who helped me when I was running away from Avshalom. So David sought asylum. He sought refuge amongst the people of Gileadi, who, remember, they were amongst the supporters of Shaul once upon a time. They were the ones who saved Shaul's body when it was killed at the beginning of the book of Shemuel Bet. And they were supporters of Shaul. They turned to also do chesed with David. And David tells his son, you have to make sure that your kingdom is one of kindness and of repaying the good that they did for me as well. So this is where also I notice you can now take this idea and put it back to Yoav. David is telling him to tie up the loose ends, all of which have to do with the concept of Hakarat HaTov. It all has to do with what David is going to deal with this as well. David did do that, but David at this point was not in a position. He wants Shelomo to maintain the status of the people of Galilei always doing chesed. David certainly did it himself, or by the time he was already, let free of the whole Avshalom saga, he was really towards the end of his rule anyway. Coming back to now a negative thing in verse 8. There's another loose end to tie up. It's by the man Shim'i ben Gera, who's the son of Yemini. He's from the tribe of Binyamin, from the place called Bahurim. What did he do? Vehu kilelani kilala nimretzet. He cursed me in a very severe way. Beyom lechti Mahanaim, when I was running away from Absalom to Mahanaim. Vehu yarad likrati hayarden, and he came to greet me at the Jordan. Remember when David was on his way back after Absalom died, Shimei realized, oh boy, I cursed David on his way out of Yerushalayim when he was going into refuge. And then David won the battle against Absalom, and here comes David back. Shimei said, he threw himself at the mercy of David and said, please forgive me, don't kill me, even though Shimei was deserving of death because he was mored b'malchut, he rebelled against the king. So David, what did he do? David swore in the name of God, im amitecha beharev, that he will not put him to death by the sword. So David made an oath. Sword is just a figure of speech, I think, over here. Yes. David was good with the slingshot for sure. Bringing us back to the days of Goliath, exactly. So David already took the oath that he himself would not seek vengeance against Shimei. And for whatever reason, David saw fit. He was ready to reestablish himself as king. He realized he made mistakes. He wasn't going to take it out on Shimei. But now Shimei is deserving of the death penalty. He can also not let it fully go, because Shimei, what will happen if Shimei dies a regular death like everybody else? Everyone's going to say, you could curse the king and get away with it. You could disrespect the king. So that can't happen either. So again, I think David, when he was on his way back from having run away, I don't think he felt like he wanted to kill somebody at that day. If you remember, he said, today is a joyous day that David gets to return to the throne. We don't put anybody to death on a joyous day. That has been a consistent theme, that when good things happen for the people, you don't take out your revenge on those same people on the day that you take over the throne. You let them go. Shaul did that. David does that. And that's what's going on over there. So, but the problem is he can't let it go in total. He's got to address the situation. David said he's not going to kill him. Now he's giving the task to Shelomo. He says in verse 9, Ve'ata al tenakehu. But you should not let him go unpunished. Ish hacham ata, for you are a very wise person. So already we see the idea that Shelomo has the wisdom. V'yadata et asher ta'aselo. You know what you should do with him. V'horata et sevato bedam sheol, and send his gray hair down to Sheol in blood. Right? Maybe, perhaps. The idea, it's a figure of speech of get rid of the guy. Verse 10, Vayishkav David im avotav, vayikaber be'ir David. David sleeps with his fathers and is buried in the city of David. David passes away. And David is done. And we'll read the ending. It says, V'hayamim asher malach David al Yisrael, 40 shana. In total, the years that David ruled over the Jewish people were 40 years. And the number 40 is always a very significant number. 40 always represents what? Completion, right? So the Mabul is 40, reigns for 40 days and 40 nights. Moshe goes up to Shabayim for 40 days and 40 nights. Things happen. The Jewish people are in the desert for 40 years. The number 40 seems to be this number that is symbolic of a completion. So David's kingdom is complete after 40 years. And the rabbis famously say David was born and died on the same day. And people who are born and die on the same day have a sense of totality, have a sense of completion to their time and their leadership. Ultimately, his 40 years were divided, says the text, Behevron malach sheva shanim. He ruled for 7 years privately in Hebron, before he assumed the national throne of Yerushalayim Malach Shloshim V'Shalosh Shanim. He ruled for 33 years in Yerushalayim after establishing it as the capital city. Verse 12, Ushlomo Yashav al Kiseh David Aviv. Shlomo sat on the throne of David, his father, Vatikon Malchuto Me'od, and his rule was firmly established. So here I feel we can pause. David has moved on. Shlomo has assumed the throne. David has given his final instructions to Shlomo about what to do with these loose ends, positive and negative. The remainder of chapter 2 is going to be how Shlomo enacts that plan with these different loose ends and how he deals with it. And then we'll move into more about Shlomo's kingdom. Enjoy. The mourning of David is not discussed in great length over here, which is interesting. It doesn't discuss crying or eulogizing or how long it went for. If you remember, there was a bit of a contention over how long they did this for Shaul. And one of the epilogues of David, we saw that they were punished for drought for the fact that they didn't properly mourn over Shaul, which doesn't get discussed over here. Something to explore. I'm not sure. I don't have an answer for that. But that's usually great leaders. It does discuss how they mourn. But here it almost just moves us into Shlomo right away. It's more about establishing Shlomo. We had David's poem, but we didn't have any, we don't see any reaction of the people, that the people cried or that the people mourned or that the people eulogized. Those were all for Shaul. Yeah, it could be assumed. But usually certain things are mentioned. Esther's right. Usually you see, Shlomo, the women cry 30 days. There's usually some detail over here. It's interesting that there isn't. We'll explore that maybe and see if I can find an answer. Yeah. Right. Well, it's interesting, the Tehillim is not mentioned at the forefront of this narrative. You're right. The books of Shemuel and the stories of David are meant to give you a persona of who David was and what he did and what he accomplished in his kingdom. But it's clear that when you look at the book of Tehillim, it even gives you indications of different events that David composed these Tehillim on. And don't forget, we had the Shirat David, which was almost an identical copy of Tehillim 18, which made its way into the book of Shemuel. Absolutely, they had many of them. I'm sure they saw them. I'm sure they read them. I'm sure they heard them. Yes, definitely. Yeah. Who? David does not speak to Adoniah before he dies. He seems to allow Shlomo to handle the Adoniah situation totally on his own. David's got a lot of children from different places, and certainly Adoniah, after what he did, maybe wasn't David's focused. Maybe he did, but the text does not feel it's important enough to record it if he did. Surely it was. Absolutely. Yes. People will recognize that Shlomo is carrying out the final instructions, and they're going to look at what Shlomo does with brilliant wisdom. They're going to see everything Shlomo does as being so wholesome and appropriate and well thought out. Nothing that the people look at of what Shlomo does they feel is haphazard. They're going to be really respectful towards Shlomo for that reason. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen.